It's our privilege now to open up some space to take questions for either or both of our speakers. If you have questions, you can come to one of the mics here in the aisles and let us know who you're addressing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is for Professor Kombo. Thank you for the very, very rich overview of African theology and providing an agenda for the way forward for Africa evangelical theology. What I'm asking for is actually a response. The typical African Christian, if you would agree, is not someone like me, Ghanaian and Methodist, or maybe someone like you, Anglican and Kenyan, but someone like a Nigerian Pentecostal. It's from them that we have the largest Christian churches in Europe, London, Amsterdam, Kiev, and major cities in the US. Given the fact that the Pentecostalism has dominated the public imagination in Africa, at least, would you agree that they are fulfilling the agenda that you put forward for evangelical theology?
Thank you. I think you're giving a very good summary of the character, the nature of African Christianity. It's known today in terms of research and all that. The fastest growing section of African Christianity is actually the Pentecostals. And it is also common knowledge that the section that is engaging more in terms of some of the issues that form the agenda for the African Christianity actually belongs in the sorts of groups that you have talked about. So yes, I think that is where the issue of vernacular languages come in. That is where the agenda for significance of the common crystallizing point for engaging the cultures and so forth come in. And yes, I think in a sense, what you have said is actually not a question, but I think an observation. And I think I just want to agree with you. Right.
Well, thank you, both of you. And both of you can answer my question since you used the word contextualization and contextual theology. Is there something that we are missing when we use the word theology without a suffix, such as Native American theology, American, European theology? Is there something that is missing when we use that word theology alone than contextual theology? Should every theology have a suffix?
Thank you for that question. I really want to say no, everything shouldn't have a label on it, honestly. I think part of the problem, and this I think kind of what I was trying to get to at the end, is that the reason for having to put those labels in front of theology is because of our captivity to what's happened with things like the modern concept of race. So I want to think about, so to speak, being freed from the shackles of that, so that we don't have to always put that label on it. I do think that maybe there's some context where that can be helpful, but the problem with putting a label in front of theology is then the people think, oh, that's for them. And the rest of us, we'll look at it as kind of a curiosity. So that can, and the last time I checked, if the church is supposed to be church, then all this they and them, etc., winds up impoverishing us. If we say, well, that's their thing, I'm glad they're into that. Or, and this is what I was getting at with the question about priorities and mission, if you're interested in addressing race and stuff, then you can read that stuff. But we don't have to talk about that. And I think, that's why, in a sense, the church or evangelicals have like a black eye about that kind of stuff, is because we still need to do a better job at showing that our priorities in mission include things like dealing with the legacy of race in America, because it doesn't seem like it's a priority. So that's kind of why I'm kind of hesitant about that. Can it be helpful? Yes. Problem is that it's helpful, and then there are negative potential consequences of it.
Would you also like to respond?
I think he has responded fairly well. That's quite representative of what I would have wanted to say, except perhaps to add that I think it is this and that, in terms of labeling, until it comes to us, and then we are not labeled. It can only be that theology and the other theology, but when it comes to us, it's then theology. Is now when theology is really being done. The others are periphery, and I think that sort of thing is the kind of thing that we need to address. We need to look at it again and be able to say, why is it that and the other one, but then when it comes to mine, then it is the real thing. Now I don't need the label. And I did pose the question, at what point does this that is peripheral, move to the center? Because there comes a time when that which was at the periphery is now the one at the center. And what do we do with that? When the periphery becomes the center, then what happens? Do we still want to go with the labels, or do we, at that point, then remove those labels?
Dr. Kombo. You said one of the needs was to engage traditional ideas and stories moving forward, and then earlier you had kind of indicated that it might indicate a different system for labeling theology and laying out theology. Could you talk some more about what that new systematic theology might look like?
Well, we are used to the systematic headings, the doctrine of God, the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine of man, and all are known, until the last one is normally eschatology. It's at the tail end of the discussion. If I want to do an African theology, I would allow the African cosmology categories to guide my process of theologizing. And I would get into a good understanding, a good grasp of the African cosmology. And in there, of course, there are studies that have shown what this is all about, and the structure and how the whole thing looks. There is God at the top. God is all in all, and at the head of everything else. Then the category of spirits and divinities would come in there. Then the category of man and the realities around that. Then you got the categories of the inanimate, existence and all that. Then you have the category of modalities. That's where you have time. That's where you have space. That's where you have, things like beauty and so on and so forth. And just do your discourse along those. If you did that, you got your logic, right there to use in terms of flow. You have it, but also in terms of dynamic interaction between each of the categories. Again, you have it right there. In terms of organizing and in terms of presenting each of the categories as a clear heading, I think, in my opinion, that is possible, and that could be done. There wouldn't be any area of non-systematic theology that you'd miss in the process of organizing and allowing that kind of logic to flow.
Thank you, Dr. Bacote, for your presentation. You mentioned that you agree with the evaluation that Black theology of liberation had lost its strength because as the context and political and social situations changed, it kind of got stuck in attending to a certain kinds of situations that are not necessarily longer present in the same strength or vitality. I wonder about other movements within the Black church, for example, the Pentecostal, gospel-centered, communitarian, socially active movements that have not articulated a formal theology, but they are actually functioning to a large extent as those communities who actually attend to the poor, to the oppressed.
So, well, I think that's part of the point that I was getting at the beginning when I was talking about traditions of preaching, music, etc. I mean, I also could have said really practical ministry, etc. So I'm certainly not devaluing them, ignoring them, etc. I think the question would be, writing about them. In other words, so that someone other than the people that are doing it know that it's going on, right? And even really, I guess, I mean, there's a lot of diversity, right, in when you're talking about the African American community, and a lot of diversity in terms of priorities for ministry, and really all the questions that I put at the end to evangelicals, I put to the Black church as well. But I mean, I would want to be hopeful because I'm an optimist. That these aren't worlds that don't really know about each other. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is difficult is sometimes in Black church context, if we're talking about the question I had about PhDs, well, one of two things happens. Either somebody who's really interested in religion and theology, you're told in the church you grow up in, you need to become a minister. And that's basically that's the only thing. The idea of being a theology professor doesn't even exist in the minds of some people, all right? So I mean, months ago, someone from the Church of God in Christ, told me this very thing, right? She was just very interested in how I got to doing this. So I think making people aware of that possibility in those contexts is one thing. Another thing, though, is that when people go to seminaries and stuff, well, most African Americans don't go to conservative seminaries, all right? I mean, they go to brand name seminaries, and there are pros and cons about that. There are significant cons, in my view, about that. But here's the thing. African Americans go to conservative institutions, and there are a lot of people who go, well, we had these certain overlaps in beliefs or whatever, but, I just couldn't take it anymore. I mean, and this is not atypical at all. So then, they're going to go somewhere else where they're going to learn less about the Bible, less about theology, but people care about their issues. I mean, that I call a tragedy. And evangelicals need to do a better job in their institutions at saying this is something that also we need to be able to talk about. And to help create trajectories so that people like me aren't a rarity. So I don't, when I go to AAR and run into other people, that we, as a joke, count how many evangelicals there are, or how many black evangelical PhDs who actually teach theology there are. All right. So, I mean, it'd be nice to, if I said there were hundreds of us, but that's a long way off.
Dr. Bacote, if Black theology is dead, how do we revive it?
Well, Alistair Keys said Black theology was dead, okay? So, and believe me, he said a lot of things in that book, actually. It's like, wow, he did make a lot of friends, I don't think, with that one. But both he and Anthony, if they don't say that it's dead, they will say, in a certain sense, it's on life support. And part of the problem is that Black theology, at least in terms of what that articulated by Cone, womanist theology, etc., it is not all that connected to the church. And some of that's because even the people who do it aren't all that interested in the church themselves. So it kind of goes back and forth. I mean, because Hopkins stated, that's 93. That's almost 20 years ago. We need to have a more vital connection to the church. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I started out my presentation by talking about Jeremiah Wright. So, I mean, he is a pastor. He does say he Black theology, but he says the Society of Christian Ethics, I'm more liberal than my congregation. So, Black theology in that sense is not mainstream. And I'm not sure that, I think that there's a value to what happened with Black theology. But, I'm an evangelical. So what I think is what I'm proposing at the end. I mean, we need to say, what can we learn from that? And what better answers can we give than Black theology gave? So, because we still need to be able to talk about how we address those things. Because for some people, it's still a big deal. How can I legitimately be who I am and be Christian or be evangelical? Isn't it code for being European or something? So we have to be able to address that. So, to me, that's one of the most important things that has to happen. But also, it's not just a problem for Black theology, it's a problem for evangelicalism as well, to deal with the way that, as Emerson and Smith put it, that we live in a racialized society, so that the way that race operates now is very much beneath the surface for the most part. But that doesn't mean that there's still not lots of work to be done. Because there's lots of work to be done. So that's my initial stab in answer to your question.
I guess in the same type of questions, and perhaps this is not a problem in Africa, I think it's not a problem in Latin America. What about a Black evangelical liberation theology in the U.S.? In the U.S., because
I don't necessarily have a problem with terms like liberation, etc. But on the one hand, there's my original answer to that question, which is, if I'm thinking about the church as a whole, I want the church as a whole to be faithful. So with what I do theologically, call this the great Bacotean fantasy, but I want what I do to be as broadly applicable as possible, which doesn't mean ignoring the very real needs in particular places. So I realize that's that's a big, gigantic task that I just laid out there. But that's what I want. I mean, that includes attending to the very real difficulties that there are in certain contexts where liberation is would be an apt term. If we're really going to take what's happening with African American males in the prison system in the United States, right? Massively disproportionately represented in the prison system of the United States. If we're really going to deal with that, then, I mean, you know, liberation is a proper category for that. I guess, again, I don't want that to have to be a special thing. I want that to be what all the church is doing.
Yeah, and I guess my concern was not precisely related to the black church, but to every church. Is it possible to be an evangelical liberation theologian?
An evangelical liberation theologian?
And I believe that, yes.
I guess that depends on how you're going to define liberation theologian.
Yes, of course, and evangelical.
Okay, well, see, that's, you've laid it. What I would say is that whether it's Latin American liberation theology or African American liberation theology, what I would want to say is that there are at least legitimate questions and attention to context that those theologies give us. And I mean, if you want to call it liberation theology, because I really take those things seriously, then fine. Correct. But if you mean, you know, do I necessarily have to be a Marxist or something like that? Well, you know, I'm not a Marxist. I don't necessarily think that everyone that's a liberation theologian is by definition that they can't be evangelical. But there are obviously significant tensions there, even with the way sometimes people are going to read the Bible. So I'm basically giving you a yes and no answer, which people who know me will not be surprised about that.
This question is for Dr. Kombo. You didn't mention anything about African theology and concern for ancestors or spiritual power and spiritual warfare, which when I have conversations among some African Christians, they talk quite a lot about that. Like just a couple of months ago, I had a chat with a person from Ethiopia. I asked him, what does your church do? And he said, well, we pray for healing, you know, for people, and we've even prayed for some people who are dead and they were raised from the dead. And I said, what do you do about missionaries or people, Westerners, who say, well, you guys are obviously poor, you know, so that's why you guys pray a lot. And he said, well, that's not the point here. We live 30 minutes away from the capital, and we can drive any time there to get medicine. But we choose to pray, and God heals. So my question is, what can African theology teach Western evangelicals, not just Western evangelicals, but rest of evangelicals around the world, in terms of your understanding of ancestors and ancestors in the biblical data, like the Old Testament is just filled with references about ancestors, and even things like spiritual power, healing, miracles, in terms of missions.
Thank you. That is a question which can take us a long time to try to unpack. Probably what I will do with that question is to make reference to the African categories that I just referred to a while ago. I did mention that the African categories of thought, if you got God there, and then you got the spirits and the divinities here, and that would then include the ancestors and so on and so forth. It would be, I think, a fascinating theological discourse to see how the Scripture speaks to those categories. Not much has been done, for instance, in the context of divinities, and attempting to understand that, at least from the point of view of what the Scripture appears to be saying. there has been, I think, minimal and probably what one could even consider an open approach to the whole question of ancestors, and yet that is quite a major issue in the context of African Christianity. And if you take African Christianity today to be, its status to be what the statistics say, then you are talking of a major, group of people whose perspective in terms of those major areas are yet to be blown, in terms of bringing that to the full understanding of what the scripture appears to be saying. So yes, I would say I didn't quite get in there, but by talking about articulating or bringing the African thought to bear in a process of theologizing, in a sense, then I did make mention of that. Yes, there's a lot that we can do. I think a lot of issues in as far as organizing and making sure that the systematic, the dogmatics within the African theology is actually brought to bear. That hasn't quite been done, and I wouldn't point you into any systematic work that has done this yet. I think what I'm talking about are basically trajectories, the dotted lines that we can follow, and the scripture being there, and our focus on faith being there. These are things that can be done, but they are not done as yet.
This is a question for either one of you. I think some of the reference points you brought up, though, about James Cone's statement that you must become black in order to be saved. The references to Jeremiah Wright. I mean, it brought me back to reading some liberation theologians, where I found myself, I was always writing in the margin, like, this is too strong here, or what's going on here? And I started to realize that a lot of that had to do with my own Northern European biases that I was bringing to the text. So I'd like to hear something about what's the relationship between context and rhetorical style, what we look for, how we measure excellence in a theological text.
I don't think, well, I think it's important to, in the case of what some liberation theologians write. I mean, there are others, they're not as incendiary. So what I guess what I would want to say is that I think, like with anything, you have to do a case-by-case basis, honestly. Because sometimes if somebody says something strong, they've got really good reason to make a strong statement. Other times, perhaps they have a problem with anger. I mean, a bad anger problem, okay? In other words, when Cone's initially writing Black theology and Black power, I mean, there's a lot of reason to be angry. There's a lot of stuff to be angry about. But does that mean that in every situation you have to express yourself in an angry way, right? And he doesn't, by the way, so that I think it'd be fair in that regard. So I don't think that it's necessarily a cultural thing about how strong you are in discourse. I mean, read the Reformers. I mean, they were pretty strong, right? I mean, they had some pretty strong things to say about the people that disagreed with them. So I do think, perhaps a way to think about it is that when you're writing something, I mean, well, who's your intended audience, and really what point are you trying to make? And is your goal just to express yourself, or is your goal to communicate? Because sometimes you can express yourself, and what you get is this. right? And which is why you're writing in the margins, right? Sometimes the reason people will react to Cone is because they don't want to deal with the fact that people who dealt with racism have a right to be angry. And they want to pretend, hey, can't we just all, get along? It's like they'd like to get along, okay? But there's some baggage they're carrying around that's legitimate. But other times, sometimes people say things and they're not helping their cause because they're so off-putting. So I think it's really a question of the stewardship of what you're writing.
This will need to be our final question.
I wondered what both of you have to say in terms of theology and the role of the church in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where 5 million people have now died and thousands of women and children are being raped. Where is the theological stance and the action of both the African church, African American church, and for that matter, Latin American church and the U.S. church in relation to this that's going on and is a very contextual issue?
Go first.
Yes, I think that is a contextual problem. The Bible does speak to issues such as that, and I think that is the whole point of liberation theology, that in the African context is part of the contextual theology that's going on there. But I think the issue there is I think wider than just the responsibility of the church, as far as that Congo problem goes. I think it has to do with the society. It has to do with our governments. It has to do with what action the government there, as well as the region and the global fraternity ought to do in a case like that. It's a moral question, I think, and of course, if we are silent, if the world is silent, if Congo itself is silent, if the region there is silent, then somebody needs to speak about it. So I think it's something that is wider than just the church. It's a moral responsibility which must go to the government. It must go to the society. It must go to the global voice.
The only thing I would add is I think perhaps the question is what is the responsibility of the church external to that context in terms of raising awareness of that situation and the fact there are situations like that all around. And really, honestly, I mean, how does that even fit into our theology about fall and redemption, et cetera, in terms of thinking about the kind of world that we live in? So I think that's when we talk about, to me, I guess I think less where's the church and how is the church forming the consciousness of people so that is something that is important to them, so that if you're a citizen of a particular country, then you think as a citizen you ought to agitate for action in a particular way, whether it's write your congressman or what have you. So that's sort of the way that I would think about it.